For days, I could barely breathe. The world had lost its color, and my body moved as if submerged in thick, suffocating water. My beloved daughter had just left for her honeymoon, filled with dreams of a bright future, and then, in a cruel twist of fate, I was informed that she had died in an accident. The words were cold and emotionless over the phone, yet they shattered me completely. Just when she had found happiness, just when she was about to start a new life with the person she loved, she was ripped away. The shock was so overwhelming that my mind refused to process it. But when I saw her lifeless body, saw the stillness where her warmth should have been, the truth became undeniable. During the funeral, her husband, Harry, wept openly, his face twisted with regret and sorrow. His cries echoed through the hall, a painful melody of loss and despair. "I can't believe this happened. If only I had done something differently." His voice broke, trembling with grief. Anyone watching would have thought he was a man devastated by the loss of his beloved wife. But something about his reaction unsettled me. His tears were there. His pain was visible, yet a strange sensation sat heavy in my chest. Something was off. It wasn't his grief that caught my attention. It was the way he expressed it, the way his words came out too measured at times, too careful, as if he were performing grief rather than experiencing it. As people gave their condolences, I listened closely to the murmurs among my daughter's friends. "I didn't even know Taylor got married," one of them whispered, and another chimed in. "Yeah, this is the first time I'm seeing her husband." That struck me as odd. My daughter had always been open with those she loved. She wasn't the type to hide something as important as her marriage, and yet not a single one of her close friends had ever met Harry before. How was that possible? Were they waiting for the wedding photos to make an announcement? But then, why would he refuse a ceremony in the first place? As I stood in that funeral hall surrounded by people who truly cared for my daughter, I realized something chilling. My daughter's life had been intertwined with mine for years, yet the man she had married felt like a stranger. The more I thought about it, the more questions swirled in my mind, each one darker than the last. Could it be that this wasn't an accident at all? That uneasy feeling in my chest tightened, suffocating me, refusing to let go. I knew then that I couldn't just sit back and grieve. I had to uncover the truth. Taylor was my pride and joy, my reason for pushing forward in life. After losing my husband in an accident years ago, she was the one who kept me going. I had raised her alone, carrying the weight of being both mother and father, and despite the struggles, she never complained. She was always bright, always kind, always strong. When she introduced me to Harry, I was relieved. He seemed like a fine young man, polite, respectful, serious. He told me he had no family, that he was alone in this world, but that Taylor made him feel whole. It sounded like a love story straight out of a novel. But now, as I stood in the aftermath of my daughter's sudden death, everything about him felt like a mystery. The first time I felt true unease about Harry was when Taylor told me about their wedding plans, or rather, the lack thereof. She had looked disappointed, her lips pressed into a thin line when she told me, "Harry doesn't like flashy things. He says having a ceremony is a waste of money and that we should just register the marriage." I remembered frowning, feeling a pang of concern. "But didn't you always want to wear a wedding dress?" I asked. She was my daughter, after all, a woman who had dreamed of that once-in-a-lifetime moment since she was a child. She hesitated before answering. "Yeah, but he really wants to save for the honeymoon. He says he wants to make it extra special." A part of me understood. Weddings were expensive. If they wanted to have a proper ceremony and go on an overseas honeymoon, the costs would pile up quickly. But still, something about the way Taylor spoke made me uneasy. It felt like she was convincing herself rather than explaining a decision they had made together. Shouldn't a relationship be about compromise? If the honeymoon was so important to Harry, couldn't he at least find a way to grant her wish too? Seeing her disappointment, I decided to intervene. "Let me talk to Harry," I said. "Maybe there's a way to work something out." When I sat down with him, I was careful with my words. I didn't want to make him feel like I was interfering too much, but at the same time, I needed him to understand. "I know it's not my place, but as a mother, I have a selfish request. I want to see my daughter in a wedding dress. Could you at least consider a small ceremony, maybe just a photo session?" At first, he hesitated. "But the honeymoon—" "I'll cover the cost," I said. "Consider it a wedding gift." The moment I made that offer, his expression brightened. He agreed immediately. That should have relieved me, but instead it made me wary. His excitement didn't come from making Taylor happy. It came from the fact that he wouldn't have to spend any money. That moment planted the first seed of doubt in my mind. Still, my daughter was happy, and that was all that mattered to me. The wedding photos turned out beautiful. She got to wear 3 dresses, each one suiting her perfectly, and even Harry seemed to enjoy the process more than expected. For a brief moment, my worries faded, and I thought, maybe I was just being too cautious. Maybe everything was fine. Then, just days later, I received the call that shattered my world. A local officer from Australia informed me that my daughter had drowned while diving. My mind rejected the words at first, refused to let them sink in. They said she had sprained her ankle the day before while sightseeing, but had insisted on going into the water anyway. Despite being an experienced diver, the injury supposedly made it difficult for her to swim, leading to the tragic accident. The moment I heard those words, something inside me twisted. It didn't make sense. Taylor was careful. She was someone who always planned ahead, someone who wouldn't take reckless risks. And more than that, something about the explanation felt too neat, too convenient. I couldn't focus on anything after that. By the time I truly processed what had happened, the funeral was already underway, and Harry had returned alone. As I sat there, holding her memorial portrait, I felt a growing certainty. There was more to this than what I was being told, and I was going to find out the truth, even if it destroyed me. I couldn't shake the unease that settled deep in my chest, the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My daughter had always been careful, never one to act recklessly, and yet I was supposed to believe that she had gone against her own instincts, injured herself, and then willingly entered the water? The pieces simply didn't fit, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I needed to dig deeper. Harry's reaction at the funeral had already planted the seeds of doubt, and now, after speaking with my niece and Anthony, those doubts had grown into something I could no longer ignore. If Harry had lied about something as simple as his family, what else had he been dishonest about? I decided to start by retracing my daughter's steps. Taylor had kept a small travel journal for every trip she'd taken, writing down details of her experiences, places she wanted to visit, and even small things like the meals she enjoyed. It was a habit she had developed as a teenager, and I hoped that maybe, just maybe, she had jotted something down about this trip as well. When I found her journal among the belongings Harry had brought back, my heart pounded as I flipped through the pages. At first, everything seemed normal. She had written about their flight, the hotel they were staying at, and some of the sightseeing they had done. But as I reached the last few entries, I noticed something strange. Her handwriting, normally so neat and precise, had become shaky and rushed. Her words no longer carried the same excitement. Instead, they were filled with uncertainty. "Harry is acting strange," one entry read. "I don't know if I'm imagining things, but he keeps looking at me like I'm in his way. I thought this trip would bring us closer, but I feel like he's growing more distant instead." Another entry, written just the day before she died, sent a chill down my spine. "I hurt my ankle today, but I don't remember how. I thought I just tripped, but Harry keeps insisting that I fell while climbing. I don't remember climbing anything. My foot doesn't even hurt that badly, but he's acting like it's a huge problem. I wanted to rest, but he kept pushing for the diving trip tomorrow. He says it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, that we can't waste the money. Maybe I'm just tired, but something feels off. I don't know why, but I feel uneasy." That was the last thing she had written. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. It was clear now that something wasn't right. If she hadn't actually climbed anything, then how had she sprained her ankle? And why was Harry so insistent on her going diving the next day despite her hesitation? It was time to confront him. When I called Harry and asked him to meet me at my house, he hesitated for a moment before agreeing. When he arrived, I was no longer the grieving mother simply looking for answers. I was someone seeking the truth. I sat across from him, placing Taylor's journal on the table between us. His eyes flickered to it, and for just a second, I saw something shift in his expression, a flash of panic. "Harry," I started, keeping my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me, "I need you to tell me the truth about what happened to my daughter." "I already told you everything," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. "Did you?" I pressed. "Because Taylor's journal tells a different story." His fingers twitched, and he let out a nervous laugh. "A journal? Come on, Mother, you're really going to believe some scribbles over the official report?" "I believe my daughter," I said firmly. "She wrote that she didn't remember climbing anything, that she didn't even feel much pain in her ankle. Yet you insisted that she had hurt herself badly. Why?" Harry's jaw clenched, and I could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to come up with an explanation. "She was probably just confused," he finally said. "People misremember things all the time." "But she didn't misremember being uneasy around you," I shot back. "Why was she afraid, Harry?" His face darkened, and for the first time, the carefully constructed mask he had been wearing since the funeral began to crack. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're being paranoid," he muttered. "You just want someone to blame." "Then let me ask you something else," I continued, unwilling to back down. "Why were there no scratches or bruises on her leg? If she had fallen while climbing, shouldn't there have been some kind of injury?" Harry's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, and then, before he could come up with another excuse, the door to the guest room swung open. Anthony stepped out, arms crossed, his presence filling the room with a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "You gonna tell her, or should I?" Anthony said, his voice dangerously calm. Harry's head snapped toward him, his eyes wide with alarm. "Tell her what?" he stammered. Anthony took a slow step forward. "Tell her how you've done this before. Tell her about the other women, the scams, the fraud, or should I go ahead and do it for you?" I turned to Harry, my heart pounding in my chest. "Other women?" I repeated. "Don't listen to him," Harry said quickly. "He's just trying to turn you against me." But Anthony wasn't having it. "Daniel," he said, and I saw the color drain from Harry's face. "That's right. That's your real name, isn't it? You think you could run forever? That you could keep lying, stealing, ruining lives? You should have known it would catch up to you eventually." I felt my breath hitch. "Daniel?" I echoed. "What is he talking about?" "Your son-in-law isn't who he says he is," Anthony said grimly. "He's been using fake names, conning women into marriage and disappearing with their money. And Taylor was just another target, wasn't she?" Harry, Daniel, didn't answer. Instead, he did something that sent a bolt of rage through me. He smirked. "So what if I was?" he muttered. "It's not like it matters now. She's gone." I felt my hands curl into fists. "You monster," I whispered. "You took my daughter's life." His smirk widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Prove it," he challenged. And that was when I knew. I wasn't going to stop until I did. I felt the world around me closing in, the walls of my home suddenly suffocating as I stared into the eyes of the man who had taken everything from me. My daughter was gone, stolen from this world before her time, and now I was face to face with the monster responsible. My hands trembled with rage, but I forced myself to stay still, to not let him see just how deeply he had gotten under my skin. because this wasn't over. Not yet. Harry? No, Daniel. Leaned back in his chair, a smug smile still playing at his lips. He thought he had won, that his secrets would remain just that, buried beneath lies, protected by the absence of proof. But he underestimated a mother's love, a mother's fury. My daughter had left me breadcrumbs, and I would follow them until the very end. "You think you're clever," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the storm raging inside me. "But you made a mistake, Daniel. You always do, don't you? That's why Anthony is here, isn't it? Because your past is catching up with you." The smirk twitched, faltering just enough to tell me I had struck a nerve. But he quickly recovered, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You have no proof," he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "You have nothing but a grieving mother's desperation. That's not enough to bring me down." Anthony scoffed, shaking his head. "You really think that?" he asked, pulling out his phone and scrolling through something before holding it up for me to see. My breath caught as I saw a series of images, documents, police reports, news articles, each one detailing the twisted web of deceit this man had spun over the years. Different names, different cities, but always the same pattern. Women falling for his charm, trusting him with their lives, only to be left broken in the end. Some were financially ruined, others had simply disappeared, and now Taylor had been added to his list. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I forced myself to swallow it down. "How did you find all of this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Anthony's expression hardened. "Because I've been following him for years," he admitted. "He conned my sister. She was one of the ones who disappeared. No body, no evidence, just a missing person case that eventually went cold. But I never stopped looking, never stopped digging, and when I saw Taylor's name in the news, I knew exactly who was responsible." I turned back to Daniel, my rage boiling over. "You did this," I hissed. "You took my daughter from me, just like you took all those other women. But you won't get away with it this time. I swear to you, I will see you rot." Daniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You really think the police will take the word of some washed-up investigator and a grieving mother over me?" he taunted. "I've played this game for a long time, sweetheart. I know how to cover my tracks." But he was wrong, because he had underestimated the strength of a mother's love. He thought he had left no evidence, that his crimes would remain buried beneath lies. But Taylor had been smarter than he realized. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small, unassuming USB drive. His smirk faded the second he saw it. "You recognize this, don't you?" I asked, watching his reaction carefully. His expression darkened, and for the first time since walking into my house, I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. Taylor had this hidden in her things. She must have suspected something because she recorded everything. "Lies," he spat, though his voice wavered. I ignored him, plugging the USB into my laptop and pressing play on the first file. And then, Taylor's voice filled the room. "I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice hushed, afraid. "Harry, no, that's not his real name, is it? He's hiding something. I saw him on the phone last night talking to someone. He didn't see me, but I heard him say my name. He said, 'She trusts me completely. It won't be long now.'" What does that mean? I don't know if I'm just being paranoid, but something doesn't feel right. If something happens to me, please don't believe it was an accident. Daniel shot up from his seat, panic flashing across his face. "Turn that off," he growled, stepping toward me. But Anthony was faster. He moved between us, shoving Daniel back. "You're done," Anthony said, his voice cold. "This is all we needed." I didn't wait another second. My fingers were already dialing the police, my voice steady as I relayed everything. The recording, the journal, the evidence Anthony had gathered, it was more than enough. Daniel tried to run, but Anthony tackled him before he could reach the door, pinning him to the ground until the police arrived. And when they did, it was almost poetic, watching the handcuffs snap around his wrists. "You have no idea what you've done," he sneered as they dragged him toward the door. But I did. I had finally given my daughter the justice she deserved. In the weeks that followed, the truth unraveled even further. The evidence against Daniel was overwhelming, and as more victims came forward, his empire of lies crumbled. He was charged not only with Taylor's murder, but with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. He would never see the outside world again, but none of it brought my daughter back. I stood by the ocean where Taylor had taken her last breath, the waves crashing against the shore. I closed my eyes, feeling the wind on my skin, imagining her standing beside me. "I did it, baby," I whispered. "I found the truth." And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since the day she died. She was gone, but she would never be forgotten. And as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would make sure her story was told, because no mother should ever have to bury her child. But if they did, then they should never stop fighting for them.